I'm Seder on the Majority Report. Ladies and gentlemen, our next guest has written for every major worthwhile publication in the country. If he has not, then you know it is not a worthwhile publication. He is also, ladies and gentlemen, David Dayen. David, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
And
Thank
not only
you.
that.
Why are you so late?
I know.
No.
I was late. I apologize. I was trying to set up this piece. But I should also say, author of Chain of Title, which some consider one of the best books on the mortgage crisis that is out there. So if you want to know, if you have not read Chain of Title, you don't know about the mortgage crisis, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
And I should also say, this is public knowledge, right? I mean,
yes,
that David Dayen is just weeks away of officially taking the title of what? Editor-in-Chief?
Executive editor of the American Prospect, available on the web at prospect.org.
This is very exciting. I'm very excited about it. Long overdue. I mean, not necessarily with the American Prospect, but it was long overdue
Right.
for you to get a role like this. But so, David, let's talk about the piece that you wrote in the Intercept last week about Wendell Primus. Wendell Primus first came to my attention, I think, well, maybe I had heard his name a while back, but most recently he was caught on tape basically telling a room full of insurers, don't worry about Medicare for all.
Yeah. In fact, this is almost kind of a roadshow that he has done, not just to insurance lobbyists, but to healthcare researchers. I found a very obscure video of him at a healthcare conference in Irvine, California, where he was making the same points, essentially downplaying Medicare for All, saying the House leadership, the Democratic leadership, would not support it, that they would go instead to try to make improvements to the Affordable Care Act. And this is one of sort of many areas in which Primus, who is the lead health policy advisor to Nancy Pelosi, is one of many areas where he has differed with progressives on these issues.
And that was, that is why we're talking about him, is because of his central role in the, and we don't have.
I think we're talking about him. I think we're talking about him because it's spilled into public view. I mean, you don't normally hear about a staffer in Congress. I mean, that's very unusual that a member of Congress would refer to a staffer by name and in a pejorative sense, and saying that they oppose this staffer's ideas. I mean, that just doesn't happen. But Wendell Primus, who has been around for quite a long time, is, somebody told me the term member staffer, that they've been around so long and accumulated so much power and has been given so much power by the speaker that he's almost this unelected voice shaping the direction of Democratic policy, particularly on health care, which, as we all know, is a huge issue for many progressives.
Okay, so I get so many questions to ask you about this, but I want to just set the table, get a sense of who he is, and then sort of what the broader implications are of this. But before we go specifically to his history, do we understand do you have a sense of what the relationship is between Pelosi and Primus? Is he reflective of what she wants to do, or is he driving the agenda? How does that work?
Well, we can go by her public statements. So in a town hall meeting in 2013, she said, and I'm quoting, "On health policy, what does Wendell think is what we say all the time about this issue." So there's no question that Wendell Primus is empowered by the speaker to speak on her behalf, to make policy on her behalf on these particular issues around healthcare and also around deficits. Actually, he's very involved in that issue as well. So we shouldn't see any distance between Wendell Primus and Nancy Pelosi. I think that actually it's kind of a failing on the part of House progressives that they kind of divorce the two, right? They say we have a problem with what Wendell Primus is saying, but not Pelosi. They are aligned. I mean, they are completely in step. I'm taking them at their word that when Wendell Primus talks, it might as well be Nancy Pelosi talking on these particular issues.
Do you think, and again, we'll get to who Wendell Primus is, because he's also, his history is also sort of fascinating and instructive, I think, of what is sort of like a generational divide here. But do you think that there is a reason why we are talking about Wendell Primus, why other members like Mark Pocan, who's quoted in your piece, are talking about Wendell Primus as opposed to Nancy Pelosi? In other words, is it conceivable that there's a sort of a good cop, bad cop quality that's going on here? Is there a conscious decision to sort of make this like, oh, this is like a sort of at arm's length from me, or is it opponents of Pelosi are using this opportunity to not knock her directly, but rather to say I'm knocking Primus so that she just gets the message, or what?
Right. I mean, I think it's easier for members to, in this case, go after a staffer rather than the Speaker of the House, who, any member needs the support or at least a working relationship with the Speaker of the House if they want to get their legislation onto the floor and passed. So it's difficult to overtly criticize the Speaker, right? But it's easier to criticize the Speaker's staffer for speaking out of turn or whatever you want to say. I think it's a bit of a cop-out, but, in context, you understand it to a degree that this is a way to express disappointment or dissatisfaction with the direction of the leadership's policies on, particularly around healthcare, without overtly attacking the Speaker. But my view is that there's just not a lot of distance there between Primus and Pelosi.
All right, so let's circle back around to Pelosi, but let's just take this little detour through Wendell Primus's history, because it really is fascinating. This is a guy who, in 1996, in response to Bill Clinton's welfare reform bill, resigns in protest. Like, that's correct. Like, just even saying those words, resigns in protest, never mind for something that I agree with, is something that's virtually unheard of, it seems like, in politics. Like this, it's a very principled position that you do not see every day. As you said, at the time, Primus was working in the Department of Health and Human Services. So he was on the Clinton administration staff. And when President Clinton said he would sign the welfare reform bill, Primus very overtly and in a public letter said, I cannot remain here. I did this analysis. I think children would be hurt by your welfare reform bill, and I cannot stay. And I cannot disown that analysis regarding the impact of the bill, and I'm going to publicly resign. Now, 5 years later... Now, wait a second. Let me just say, just to put a fine point on this, this is like the type of guy, like I would have a poster of this guy in my, in my apartment back in the day. Right. I mean, it's like, Now, I want to say two things about it, though. First of all, 5 years later, Primus pops up in the New York Times after there were studies showing that the impact of welfare reform was not as acute, at least at that time, which was during an economic boom. I mean, from 96 to 2001 is not sort of a stress test of welfare reform. Yeah, well, he's, I guess, 6 or 7 years away from like finding out that, oh, wait a second, maybe I should have. Yeah, it doesn't work. Right.
But in 2001, he tells New York Times, welfare reform is working better than I thought it would, and whatever we've been doing over the last 5 years, we ought to keep going. So a little bit too credulous there. It doesn't discount his principled resignation, but it adds some context. The second thing is that, what was he actually doing here? The fight over welfare reform to someone like Primus, who is indicative of a lot of liberals in his generation who were beaten down by the Reagan Revolution and whose goal in public policy is to just sort of hang on to whatever scraps of the welfare state were still left after the ravages of Reaganism. I mean, that is his M.O., and it was his M.O. in 1996 when he did this resignation, and it's his M.O. today. He is someone who thinks that what you do as a lefty is defend what we have now from right-wing assault and never expand anything, because America can't do that. He believes there are limits and constraints to progressive policy, and that the best we can do is make sure food stamps are paid for, and make sure LIHEAP is paid for, and things like that, rather than transform the system.
And so to be clear, this is a different story than God, I can't remember the guy who went around and twisted arms for Medicare D and the Republicans, who was the head of that.
DeLay?
Not DeLay, but the guy who was head of the committee and literally was negotiating with an insurance company at that time. His name escapes me. I can't remember.
Oh, Billy Tauzin.
Yes, it was Billy Tauzin. Right, exactly. And
he was with the pharmaceutical industry, but yes.
Well, he was literally...
He ended up becoming the head of pharma.
And he was negotiating for that job while he was developing Medicare Part D, which was the drug...
Now, he was a member, not a staffer.
Right.
To be clear.
But I'm sure there are examples of staffers who do that type of thing too, where it's just completely, I'm going to leverage this as a job in the private sector. This isn't that type of story, is it?
Yeah, Primus is not a neoliberal, right? He's not a Clintonite. He is not someone who is really out to reduce the welfare state in meaningful ways, right? He is sort of a center on budget and policy priorities, where he worked for a time in between the Clinton administration and Pelosi, or the Brookings Institution. There's a type of liberal that's just sort of a beaten down liberal. I say the last of the loser liberals in the piece, who just wants to hang on to these little scraps of the welfare state and can't conceive of government doing anything more ambitious than that. And this is useful sometimes when, Primus clashed with Rahm Emanuel during the Affordable Care Act debates. And we remember that Pelosi was the one who said, after Scott Brown defeated Martha Coakley in the seat for Ted Kennedy's Senate seat, and Democrats suddenly lost a 60-vote majority in the Senate, Pelosi was the one saying, we have to keep going, we have to keep going. And Primus was aligned with that, right?
Whereas Rahm Emanuel was saying, we should cut back and just go for something, call it the ACA, but let's just do small.
He wanted to stop anything.
Right.
So they're useful. What Dean Baker, who's a progressive economist I'm sure you've had on the show, what he said to me for this piece is that, they do great work between the 40-yard lines, right?
Right.
When something might be cut, they're there to tell you why it's important, and it's good and useful. But it's never going to get you into the end zone. It's never going to change the game. They just don't. They have a very narrow mindset on policy debates, and Primus exemplifies that. And I think that's clear in how he's talked about Medicare for all. I think it's clear in something that I go into detail with in the piece, which is this question of drug price legislation that Primus is spearheading, going against a more aggressive solution put forward by House Democrats and trying to come up with something that the Trump administration can sign, which seems a little cramped. It's just their mindset. They're beaten down by the Reagan Revolution. There's a historical context to it. They grew up seeing all of these things go away, and they built this sort of defensive crouch. Let's just protect what we have. Let's not make trouble, and let's move forward.
And so, okay, and so we have this. This is a problem because
it's a problem now because we have a new crop, a new generation of Democrats who have much broader policy ambitions, animated by the fact that the last 40 years of this defensive crouch has not worked. Right? I mean, we have soaring income inequality. We have 30 million people uninsured. We have many more underinsured. We have stagnant wages that we've had for the last 40 years. People think the status quo and just protecting what we have is not good enough, particularly the new group of Democrats on the left. And now, instead of aligning with a Wendell Primus to fight Clintonites, they are in open competition with Wendell Primus over the future of liberal policymaking.
Now, I really want to limit this to this conversation to Pelosi in the House. But although there's obviously like a parallel fight happening, in the context of the presidential election with Bernie and Cap. And I don't want to get into that because I need to save that for tomorrow. but like what is going on? What is going on here with that fight? Because Pelosi is out there making a real show, right? This is not like, oh, she said something offhand and people are blowing it up. There's been a consistent drumbeat from her to attack this new generation that is, led by half a dozen Democratic women, frankly, who are freshmen, at least in the public perspective. But what is going on with that? Like, what is the theory here? Like, why are they being attacked when it was a completely different faction that was literally trying to take her out? In fact, it seems to me that incoming freshmen, the more progressive ones, were the ones who ultimately sort of like shored up her support. What is going on? Is this for show? Is this for the protection of some of these blue dogs who won in 2018, where you had like a lot of purple districts turn, a Democrat won in purple districts? Like, what's going on?
Right. I mean, I don't think it's for show. I think part of it is protection of the new Democrat, blue dog, purple state freshman members who represent the margin of the House majority. But I also think it plays back into this situation with Wendell Primus, who views House progressives as people who leadership needs to be protected from, right? This idea that these that progressive ideas must be shunned because the best you can do in public policy making is just protect and defend the status quo, and that we hear about this sort of concept that Republicans cater to their base and Democrats ignore their base, or one fears their base and one doesn't, right? And that's, I think, what this is about, right? It's Pelosi, who's comes from the old guard. Primus comes from the old guard of thinking, that fears moving, an inch down the football field on these various policies, and it's almost a fear of governing in some ways, or at least meeting the political moment. Their particular beliefs about policy have not been updated to match the political moment. I mean, Pelosi is still, petrified of the deficit. She did a speech last year on the floor of the House praising Pete Peterson, who was this billionaire that devoted the end of his life to trying to cut Social Security.
Yes,
and she gave a celebratory address on the floor of the House for him. Primus is at the center of those debates, by the way. He constantly talks about the deficit. He was deeply involved in ensuring that there was a pay-go provision in the House rules that says you can't put a new program up unless you offset it somewhere else in the budget. This is a mindset. This is a worldview, and progressives of the modern era of these new freshmen represent a threat to that worldview. And whether it's sincere a sincere disagreement over policy or a fear about the political ramifications, either way, the functionally it's the same, right? I mean, functionally, that's how it manifests itself in this tension that you're seeing right now within the House caucus.
Okay.